The California sun blazed overhead as Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport bus at Naval Base San Diego. The familiar smell of ocean salt mixed with diesel fuel and hot concrete filled her nostrils, a scent that had become as much a part of her identity as the worn dog tags hanging beneath her uniform. After 3 years of classified operations with SEAL Team 5 in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, the sprawling naval base felt almost surreal in its normalcy. Sarah adjusted the olive drab duffel bag slung over her shoulder, its contents representing 8 years of military service compressed into a single canvas container. Inside were the usual personal effects photos of her family in East Los Angeles, a rosary her grandmother had pressed into her hands the day she left for basic training, and a few books she'd read and reread during long deployments, but hidden. Beneath the mundane items were the real treasures: commendation letters, mission patches from operations she could never discuss, and a small wooden carving of a wolf that her Afghan interpreter had given her during their last patrol together. The base buzzed with activity typical of a Tuesday afternoon. Sailors in crisp white uniforms hurried between buildings, their conversations a mixture of technical jargon and casual banter. Young recruits moved in nervous clusters, their fresh haircuts and uncertain expressions marking them as newly arrived. Sarah observed it all with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice details that others missed, the subtle hierarchies in posture, the way experienced personnel moved with purpose, while newcomers hesitated at every intersection. At 5 feet 4 inches and 135 pounds, Sarah had learned early in her military career that first impressions rarely worked in her favor. Her compact frame and youthful features, she could still pass for a college student despite being 27, led people to make assumptions that she'd spent years proving wrong. The scars on her arms and shoulders, hidden beneath her long-sleeved uniform, told a different story. A pale line across her left bicep came from shrapnel during a firefight in Helmand Province. The burns on her hands were souvenirs from pulling a wounded teammate from a burning vehicle. These marks were her real credentials, earned in moments when survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute trust in her training. Her reassignment to Naval Base San Diego represented a significant shift in her career trajectory. For the past 3 years, she'd lived in a world of midnight raids, hostile territory, and missions that didn't officially exist. Now, she would be responsible for training the next generation of Navy personnel, a role that required a completely different skill set. Instead of eliminating threats, she would be nurturing potential. Instead of operating in shadows, she would be teaching in classrooms and training facilities. The transition wasn't entirely voluntary. Her commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had been direct during their final briefing in Virginia. "Martinez, you're one of the finest operators I've ever had the privilege to serve with," he'd said, his weathered face serious. "But you've been deployed for 36 of the last 42 months. The human mind and body have limits, even yours. This assignment isn't a demotion. It's an investment. The Navy needs experienced warriors like you to pass on what you've learned." Sarah had accepted the assignment without complaint, though part of her mourned leaving the tight-knit brotherhood of her SEAL team. Those men had become her family. In the truest sense, bonded by shared experiences that civilians could never fully understand. They'd seen her at her best and worst, had trusted her with their lives on countless occasions, and had never once questioned her right to stand beside them. Leaving them felt like abandoning a piece of herself. As she navigated toward the administrative building to complete her check-in procedures, Sarah mentally reviewed the briefing materials she'd studied during the cross-country flight. Her primary responsibility would be working with basic underwater demolition SEAL, BUD-S candidates, but she would also be conducting leadership seminars for various recruit classes. The statistics were sobering. only about 25% of candidates successfully completed SEAL training, and the failure rate was often attributed to mental rather than physical limitations. The challenge excited her more than she'd initially expected. During her deployments, she'd witnessed firsthand how the difference between life and death often came down to intangible qualities: determination, adaptability, the ability to function under extreme stress. These weren't skills that could be taught through textbooks or lectures. They had to be forged through experience and tested under pressure. Sarah's own journey to the SEALs had been anything but conventional. Growing up in East LA, she'd been the daughter of a single mother who worked double shifts at a local hospital to keep their small apartment. The neighborhood was rough, controlled by gangs who saw young people as either potential recruits or obstacles to be eliminated. Sarah had chosen a third option: escape through education and military service. Her high school guidance counselor had initially discouraged her from considering the Navy, suggesting instead that she pursue nursing or teaching, more appropriate careers for a young woman. But Sarah had already made up her mind. She'd spent countless hours researching military occupations, drawn to the challenge and the opportunity to serve something greater than herself. The fact that women weren't officially allowed in combat roles at the time had only strengthened her resolve to prove that gender was irrelevant when it came to courage and competence. Basic training at Naval Station Great Lakes had been her first taste of military life, and she'd excelled from day one. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands and mental pressure, Sarah found herself thriving in the structured environment. Her drill instructors, initially skeptical of the quiet young woman from Los Angeles, quickly recognized her potential. She graduated as honor recruit, earning the respect of her peers and the attention of senior leadership. The path from there to the SEALs had been long and deliberately challenging. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially when it came to changing traditional roles and expectations. Sarah had spent years in various Navy positions, consistently performing above expectations while quietly building the qualifications and endorsements necessary to eventually apply for SEAL training. When the program finally opened to women in 2016, she was among the first to volunteer. SEAL training had been the most brutal experience of her life, designed to push human beings beyond their perceived limitations. The instructors had shown no mercy, and Sarah had expected none. She'd endured the same physical torture, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure as her male counterparts. More than once, she'd questioned her sanity for voluntarily subjecting herself to such punishment. But each time the temptation to quit arose, she thought about the young girls in her old neighborhood who needed to see that barriers could be broken. Now, walking across the sun-baked concrete of Naval Base San Diego, Sarah carried with her not just personal achievements, but the weight of representation. Every action she took, every decision she made, would be scrutinized and evaluated not just on its individual merits, but as a reflection on all the women who might follow in her footsteps. The mess hall loomed ahead, a massive building that could accommodate hundreds of personnel during peak hours. Through the large windows, she could see the usual controlled chaos of military dining sailors moving efficiently through serving lines. Conversations conducted at volumes that competed with clattering trays and industrial dishwashers. It was a microcosm of military life itself, diverse backgrounds brought together by common purpose, individual personalities subsumed into the greater organizational mission. Sarah paused at the entrance, taking a moment to center herself. Inside that building were the people she would be training, leading, and ultimately preparing for the realities of military service. Some would be fresh recruits, still adjusting to the dramatic shift from civilian to military life. Others would be experienced personnel seeking advancement or specialized training. All of them would be forming their first impressions of their new instructor based on nothing more than her appearance and demeanor. She straightened her shoulders, and walked through the door, ready to begin the next chapter of her service. The familiar sounds and smells of the mess hall washed over her as she joined the flow of personnel moving toward the serving line. Her plan was simple: grab a quick meal, review her training materials one final time, and report to her new commanding officer for the official welcome briefing. What Sarah didn't anticipate was that her first real test as an instructor would begin before she'd even officially started work. Sometimes the most important lessons in leadership came not from carefully planned curricula, but from unexpected moments when character was revealed and assumptions were challenged. Today would be one of those moments, and it would set the tone for everything that followed in her new assignment. Jake Morrison pushed through the mess hall doors with the swagger of a man who'd never met a challenge. He couldn't bulldoze through with sheer bravado. At 6'2" and 210 pounds of muscle, earned through 4 years of Division I football. At the University of Texas, he commanded attention wherever he went. The 22-year-old from Houston carried himself like royalty surveying his kingdom, and in many ways, that's exactly how he viewed his current situation at Naval Base San Diego. Behind him trailed his carefully cultivated entourage. Tommy Kowalski from Detroit, a former auto mechanic whose knuckles bore the scars of countless bar fights. Brad Chun from Portland, whose quiet intensity masked a fierce competitive streak developed through years of martial arts training. Marcus Williams from Atlanta, whose smooth talk had gotten him out of more trouble than his street smarts had gotten him into. And Kevin O'Brien from Boston, whose family's 3-generation Navy tradition had instilled in him an unshakable belief in military hierarchy and masculine dominance. Together, they formed what the other recruits had dubbed Morrison's Marauders, a tight-knit group that had dominated every aspect of recruit life since arriving at the base 6 weeks earlier. They consistently scored highest on physical fitness tests. Their barracks inspection ratings were impeccable, and their collective charisma had earned them unofficial leadership roles among the 97 members of their recruit class. But Morrison's leadership style was built more on intimidation than inspiration. He'd learned early in life that physical presence and verbal dominance could substitute for actual competence, at least in the short term. In high school, his imposing size and athletic ability had made him a local celebrity. College had reinforced these lessons. Coaches praised his aggressive playing style. Professors gave him passing grades to maintain his eligibility, and fellow students either sought his approval or avoided him entirely. The military, Morrison had assumed, would be more of the same. He'd enlisted not out of patriotic calling or desire to serve, but because his NFL dreams had been crushed by a knee injury during his senior season. The Navy had seemed like a logical next step, a place where his natural leadership, abilities, and physical prowess would be recognized and rewarded. What he hadn't anticipated was how military structure would slowly erode the casual dominance he'd enjoyed in civilian life. Basic training had been a rude awakening, but Morrison had adapted by applying the same principles that had worked for him before. He'd identified the strongest personalities in his unit, and either recruited them as allies or neutralized them as threats. He'd memorized regulations not to follow them more effectively, but to use them as weapons against weaker recruits. And most importantly, he'd learned to project an image of confident competence that masked the growing anxiety he felt about his place in the military hierarchy. The mess hall represented Morrison's natural habitat, a social space where informal power structures could be established and maintained. He'd claimed a large corner table during his first week at the base, and through a combination of physical presence and social manipulation, had made it understood that this was his territory. Other recruits might use the table when he wasn't present, but they invariably yielded when Morrison and his crew arrived. Today's lunch had started like any other. Morrison had held court while his friends discussed weekend liberty plans, upcoming training exercises, and their shared disdain for the base's more studious recruits. The conversation had taken on the familiar rhythm of young men trying to impress each other with increasingly outrageous stories and crude humor. "Did you see that new batch of female sailors who came in yesterday?" Tommy had asked, his Detroit accent thick with suggestion. Some of them looked like they might actually know which end of a rifle to hold. "Give it a week," Brad had replied, his martial arts background making him slightly more respectful than his companions, but still willing to play along. Boot camp's one thing, but real Navy life is different. Most of them will wash out once they realize what they've gotten themselves into. Morrison had been about to add his own commentary when his attention was caught by a solitary figure seated at a small table near the back corner of the mess hall. The woman was unremarkable, at first glance average height, slight build, wearing standard issue fatigues that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and she was methodically working through what appeared to be a turkey sandwich and chips. What struck Morrison wasn't her appearance, but her isolation. In his experience, military personnel especially, women rarely ate alone unless they were outcasts or new arrivals who hadn't yet found their social niche. Either scenario suggested vulnerability, and Morrison had built his reputation on identifying and exploiting such weaknesses. "Gentlemen," he had announced to his table, nodding toward Sarah, "looks like we have a new lamb who's wandered into the wrong pasture." His friends followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from casual interest to predatory anticipation. This was a familiar ritual Morrison would identify a target, usually someone he perceived as weak or different, and the group would participate in what he called teaching them their place. It wasn't malicious, in Morrison's mind. It was simply the natural order of military life. Strong personalities rose to the top. Weak ones were weeded out, and everyone learned valuable lessons about hierarchy and respect. "She looks lost," Marcus had observed, his Atlanta drawl carrying a note of false sympathy. "Maybe we should help her find somewhere more appropriate to sit." Kevin, whose Boston Irish background had instilled in him a complex mixture of chivalry and chauvinism, had frowned slightly. "She's not bothering anyone, Jake. Maybe we should just let her eat in peace." But Morrison's mind was already made up. The woman's quiet confidence irritated him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about her posture, the way she seemed completely comfortable being alone, that challenged his understanding of how people should behave in social hierarchies. In his world, isolation meant weakness, and weakness demanded correction. "O'Brien, your bleeding heart is showing again," Morrison had said, rising from his seat with theatrical purpose. "This isn't about being mean, it's about maintaining standards. She needs to understand how things work around here." The approach to Sarah's table had felt like a scene from countless movies Morrison had watched growing up, the confident alpha male asserting dominance over his territory, while his loyal followers provided backup and witnesses. He'd played similar scenes dozens of times during his high school and college years, and the script was always the same. Identify the target, establish superiority, accept submission, move on to the next challenge. What Morrison failed to recognize was that his approach was being observed not just by his immediate circle, but by dozens of other personnel throughout the mess hall. Some watched with the casual interest of people witnessing predictable drama. Others seemed uncomfortable, perhaps remembering their own experiences being on the receiving end of such encounters. A few, particularly the more experienced sailors, watched with expressions that suggested they recognized something Morrison had missed entirely. As he slid uninvited into the chair across from Sarah, Morrison felt the familiar rush of dominance that came from controlling a social situation. His friends arranged themselves around the table in a practiced formation designed to block escape routes while maximizing their intimidation factor. Tommy positioned himself directly behind Sarah's chair, while Brad and Marcus flanked the table on either side. Kevin, still visibly uncomfortable, remained standing at a slight distance. "Hey there, darling," Morrison began, his Texas accent deliberately exaggerated for effect. The word darling was chosen specifically for its condescending intimacy familiar, enough to establish his assumed superiority, but casual enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. "Looks like you've wandered into the wrong section of the mess hall." Sarah's continued eating without acknowledgement struck Morrison as either disrespectful defiance or naive ignorance. Either way, it demanded escalation. He leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table in a gesture designed to claim the space as his own. "This is our table," he continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Has been for weeks now. I'm sure you can find somewhere more ... appropriate for someone like you." The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air with deliberate ambiguity. Morrison had learned that vague implications were often more effective than direct insults. They allowed the target's imagination to fill in the worst possible meanings, while giving him room to deny specific intent if confronted by authority figures. Around them, the normal sounds of the mess hall seemed to fade as other diners became aware of the developing confrontation. Conversations grew quieter, glances became more frequent, and the atmosphere took on the electric tension that preceded either violence or humiliation. Morrison felt the familiar satisfaction that came from being the center of attention, the focal point around which social dynamics revolved. This was his element, the moment when his natural advantages in size, confidence, and social dominance would assert themselves over someone who clearly didn't understand the unwritten rules of military hierarchy. What he couldn't have anticipated was that he was about to encounter someone for whom those rules were not just understood, but irrelevant, someone whose quiet confidence came not from naive optimism or social awkwardness, but from experiences that had forged her into something far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The mess hall buzzed with the familiar chaos of a military lunch hour, hundreds of conversations blending into a constant hum, metal trays clattering against tables, and the distant sound of industrial dishwashers working through mountains of plates and utensils. But for Sarah Martinez, sitting alone at her corner table, the world had narrowed to a single point of focus: the 5 young men who had just made the biggest mistake of their naval careers. She took another deliberate bite of her turkey sandwich, chewing slowly while her mind automatically cataloged everything about the situation. Years of combat experience had taught her that the moments before violence erupted were often the most important, when training, instinct, and tactical awareness either saved lives or cost them. These recruits had no idea they were about to receive a master class in why assumptions could be fatal. Morrison was still talking, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing second. "I said, are you listening to me, sweetheart?" His Texas drawl had thickened with frustration, a tell that indicated his rising anger levels. Behind him, his 4 companions shifted nervously, their initial confidence beginning to waver as they sensed something had changed in the atmosphere around their target. Sarah's dark eyes remained fixed on Morrison's face, studying him with the same intensity she'd once reserved for suspected enemy combatants. 6'2", approximately 210 pounds, right-handed based on his unconscious gestures. Probable former athlete, given his posture and muscle development. Most importantly, 0 actual combat training, evident from his amateur intimidation techniques, and complete lack of situational awareness. What Morrison couldn't see were the subtle changes occurring in Sarah's body language. Her breathing had shifted from casual to controlled. Her posture had imperceptibly straightened, and her hands, still folded peacefully in front of her head, repositioned themselves in a way that would allow instant movement in any direction. To the untrained eye, she appeared completely relaxed. To anyone with military experience, She looked like a coiled spring waiting to be released. You know what I think? Morrison continued, emboldened by what he interpreted as submissive silence. I think you're one of those women who joined the Navy thinking it would be easy, thinking you could just coast along while real sailors do the heavy lifting. Am I right, boys? His friends provided the expected chorus of agreement, though Sarah noted that their enthusiasm seemed forced. Tommy Kowalski's hands were clenched into fists, but his eyes kept darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. Brad Chun maintained perfect posture, but she could see tension in his shoulders that suggested second thoughts about this particular demonstration of group loyalty. Marcus Williams was putting on a show of casual confidence, leaning against a nearby chair with studied nonchalance. But Sarah recognized the performance for what it was, a young man trying to project toughness he didn't actually feel. Kevin O'Brien remained the furthest from the confrontation, positioned where he could either join in or distance himself, depending on how events unfolded. Around them, the normal sounds of the mess hall were gradually fading as other personnel became aware of the developing situation. Conversations at nearby tables had grown quieter, and Sarah could feel dozens of eyes tracking the interaction. Some observers showed uncomfortable curiosity. Others displayed the kind of alert attention that came from recognizing potential trouble brewing. In her peripheral vision, she spotted Master Chief Rodriguez at a table across the room. The grizzled veteran had suspended his conversation with two junior officers and was watching the scene with professional interest. But there was something else in his expression, a slight smile that suggested he might know more about the unfolding drama than the participants realized. Sarah had been in similar situations before, though the stakes had been considerably higher. She remembered a village elder in Helmand Province who had refused to acknowledge her presence during a crucial negotiation, insisting that his cultural traditions prevented him from dealing with women. That confrontation had required delicate diplomacy to avoid jeopardizing the entire mission. This situation called for a different approach entirely. She set down her sandwich with deliberate precision, her movements controlled and economical. Then she folded her hands in front of her on the table, a gesture that appeared casual, but actually represented a fundamental shift in her tactical posture. Any member of SEAL Team 5 would have recognized the position immediately. It was Sarah's signature stance when transitioning from diplomatic engagement to combat readiness. Morrison, she said quietly, using his name for the first time. The simple act of identification seemed to surprise him. Bullies rarely expected their targets to know who they were. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Her voice carried a quality that made nearby conversations pause. Entirely, it wasn't loud or aggressive, but it possessed an undertone of absolute authority that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the mess hall like a blade. Morrison's cocky expression faltered slightly, though his pride wouldn't allow him to show uncertainty in front of his audience. I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to walk away from this table, Sarah continued, her tone remaining perfectly level. You can return to your meal, continue your conversation with your friends, and we can all pretend this interaction never happened. I strongly recommend you take this option. The offer was delivered without emotion, threats, or pleading, just a simple statement of available choices and their implications. It was the same voice she'd used when giving enemy combatants their final chance to surrender before her unit opened fire, the tone of someone who had faced life-and-death decisions and emerged victorious. Morrison's face flushed red, his masculine pride challenged by what he interpreted as a diminutive woman giving him orders. Everything about his upbringing, his social conditioning, and his understanding of hierarchical relationships rebelled against the idea of backing down from someone he'd already categorized as inferior. Listen here, little girl, he snarled, his voice rising enough to attract attention from across the room. I don't know who you think you are, but you're about to learn some respect. Around their table, The atmosphere had become electric with tension. Other diners had stopped eating entirely, their attention focused on the unfolding confrontation. Some junior personnel looked uncomfortable, sensing trouble, but uncertain whether they should intervene. The more experienced sailors wore expressions of anticipation, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen. Sarah's expression never changed. She'd given Morrison his chance, offered him a graceful exit from a situation he didn't understand. His rejection of that offer told her everything she needed to know about his character, and his likely response to alternative approaches. Some lessons she'd learned could only be taught through direct experience. Morrison leaned forward aggressively, his impressive bulk casting a shadow across her tray. "So here's what's going to happen, sweetheart," he continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "You're going to apologize for wasting our time. Find yourself a more appropriate place to sit, and remember this lesson about showing proper respect to your betters." He reached across the table as if to grab her food tray, apparently intending to remove it himself as a final demonstration of his authority. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. Because at that moment, Morrison discovered that the quiet woman he'd been bullying was actually Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, decorated Navy SEAL, Bronze Star recipient, and one of the most lethal warriors currently serving in the United States military. The lesson was about to begin. The moment Morrison's hand moved toward her tray, Sarah Martinez's 8 years of elite military training activated like a perfectly calibrated weapon system. Time seemed to slow as her muscle memory took control, transforming her from a quiet woman eating lunch into one of the deadliest operators in the United States Navy. Her left hand intercepted Morrison's wrist with surgical precision, fingers wrapping around his arm in a grip that felt like a steel vise. The contact was so smooth and effortless that many observers didn't immediately realize what had happened. Morrison's confident reach simply stopped, as if he'd hit an invisible wall made of pure determination. "What the?" Morrison began. But his words were cut short as Sarah stood in one fluid motion that seemed to defy physics. Her right hand joined her left on his wrist, and suddenly, Morrison's impressive 210-pound frame was being redirected with the kind of precise, biomechanical leverage that made size and strength irrelevant. Sarah applied a textbook compliance hold, rotating Morrison's arm behind his back with just enough pressure to demonstrate complete control without causing actual injury. His knees buckled involuntarily as nerve clusters responded to the perfectly applied technique, and he found himself bent over the table with his face inches from the sandwich he'd tried to steal. "Basic military courtesy, Morrison," Sarah said, calmly, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Rule number 1, always show respect to your fellow service members." The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Morrison's friends stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet woman they'd been intimidating had moved like liquid mercury, transforming their friend from aggressor to victim with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Tommy Kowalski took an instinctive step backward, his street fighting experience telling him that he was witnessing something far beyond his comprehension. Brad Chun's martial arts background allowed him to appreciate the technical perfection of Sarah's movement, and his face went pale as he realized the vast gulf between his tournament training and whatever Sarah had just demonstrated. Marcus Williams and Kevin O'Brien exchanged panicked glances, suddenly aware that their participation in Morrison's bullying had put them in a situation with potentially serious consequences. The casual dominance display they'd expected to witness had transformed into something that felt like watching a nature documentary about apex predators. "Let me go," Morrison gasped, his voice strained by both physical discomfort and wounded pride. He tried to struggle against Sarah's hold, but every movement only demonstrated more clearly how completely she controlled the situation. His attempts to break free were like a child trying to escape a parent's firm but gentle guidance. "In a moment," Sarah replied, maintaining the hold with effortless ease. "But first, I think there's someone here who'd like to meet you." As if summoned by her words, Master Chief Rodriguez appeared beside their table. A grizzled veteran's weathered face bore an expression of barely contained amusement as he surveyed the scene. Behind him, 2 junior officers followed, their expressions mixing curiosity with professional concern. "Chief Martinez," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the respect due to a proven warrior. "I didn't realize you'd arrived on base." "Welcome to San Diego." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. The woman controlling him with one hand wasn't just another sailor. She was a chief petty officer, outranking every person at the table by several pay grades. But Rodriguez wasn't finished with his introduction. "Gentlemen," he continued, addressing Morrison's stunned companions, "allow me to introduce Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, recently transferred from SEAL Team 5. 3 combat deployments. Bronze Star with V device for Valor, and distinguished graduate of Bud S-Class 301. The silence that followed was so complete that the normal sounds of the mess hall seemed amplified. Hundreds of sailors had stopped eating to watch the unfolding drama, and many were now murmuring among themselves as word of Sarah's identity spread through the crowd like wildfire. Morrison's world tilted completely off its axis. The implications of Rodriguez's introduction crashed over him in waves of humiliation and terror. Not only had he just attempted to bully a superior officer, but that officer was a decorated Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. Sarah released Morrison's arm and stepped back, allowing him to straighten slowly. His face had drained of all color, and his hands shook slightly as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. Around him, his friends looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. "Chief Martinez is also your new Bud S instructor," Rodriguez added with obvious satisfaction. "She'd be responsible for your advanced training starting next week." The final piece of information landed like a bomb. Not only had Morrison just humiliated himself in front of half the base, but the woman he'd tried to intimidate would now have direct authority over his military career. Every day for the foreseeable future, he would be under the command of someone he'd just demonstrated complete disrespect toward. Sarah looked at each of the 5 recruits in turn, her dark eyes assessing them with the same professional interest a scientist might show when examining laboratory specimens. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no vindictiveness, just the calm authority of someone who had faced real enemies in actual combat. "Gentlemen," she said, "this has been an excellent introduction to your first lesson in advanced leadership training. You've just learned why assumptions can be dangerous, why respect must be earned through character rather than demanded through intimidation, and why good judgment is often more valuable than physical size." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, while Morrison and his friends stood in various states of shock and humiliation. "Report to Training Bay 3 at 06:00 tomorrow morning," Sarah continued. "We'll begin with basic respect protocols and work our way up to more complex concepts like situational awareness and threat assessment. I have a feeling you're going to learn a great deal over the next few weeks." Master Chief Rodriguez's grin widened as he witnessed Morrison's complete transformation from predator to prey. The young man who had swaggered into the mess hall 30 minutes earlier now looked like he wanted to resign from the Navy immediately. "Chief Martinez," Rodriguez said formally, "would you care to join us for coffee? I believe these recruits need some time to process today's lesson." Sarah nodded and gathered her belongings, leaving Morrison and his companions to contemplate their new reality. As she walked away with Rodriguez and the other officers, conversations gradually resumed throughout the mess hall, but everyone present would remember the day they witnessed a perfect demonstration of why underestimating people based on appearances could be the costliest mistake of their lives. At 0545 hours the next morning, Jake Morrison stood outside Training Bay 3 with his 4 companions, each man lost in his own private nightmare of anticipation and dread. The California dawn was still breaking over Naval Base San Diego, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Today, however, the sunrise felt more like a countdown to execution. Morrison had barely slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd relived the moment when Sarah Martinez had transformed from what he'd assumed was a helpless victim into a force of nature that had rendered him completely powerless. The memory of her calm voice explaining basic military courtesy while holding him in a grip that felt like a mechanical vice would haunt him for the rest of his life. Around him, his friends shifted nervously in the pre-dawn chill. Tommy Kowalski kept cracking his knuckles a nervous habit that had intensified dramatically since yesterday's humiliation. Brad Chun stood in perfect parade rest position, but his usual martial arts confidence had been replaced by the wide-eyed uncertainty of someone who'd realized his skills were amateur hour compared to what they'd witnessed. Marcus Williams had abandoned his usual smooth-talking bravado entirely, while Kevin O'Brien looked like he was considering requesting an immediate transfer to another base, possibly on another continent. None of them had spoken much since leaving the mess hall the previous day. What was there to say? They'd collectively made fools of themselves in front of hundreds of their peers, and now they were about to face the consequences. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all straighten instinctively. Sarah Martinez appeared around the corner of the building, moving with the fluid efficiency that marked her as someone who never wasted motion or energy. She was dressed in standard Navy PT, gear gray t-shirt, blue shorts, and running shoes that looked like they'd covered serious miles. Her hair was pulled back in the same regulation bun, and her expression was professionally neutral. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, checking her watch. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality. It's the foundation of military discipline." Morrison opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? Sorry for trying to intimidate you yesterday? I didn't know you were a decorated war hero. Every potential response sounded pathetic in his head, so he settled for a weak, "Good morning, Chief." Sarah studied each of them in turn, her dark eyes assessing their mental state with the same systematic approach she'd once used to evaluate potential threats in hostile territory. Morrison felt like he was being x-rayed, his every weakness and insecurity laid bare under that steady gaze. "Before we begin today's training," Sarah said, "I want to address what happened yesterday in the mess hall. Morrison, you and your friends made some fundamental errors in judgment that we need to discuss." Morrison's stomach dropped. He'd hoped they might skip past the incident and move directly to whatever torture she had planned for them. But apparently, Sarah believed in thorough analysis of failure, a trait that probably explained her success in the military's most elite units. "The first mistake," Sarah continued, beginning to pace back and forth in front of them, "was assuming you understood the situation based on superficial observations. You saw a woman sitting alone and immediately categorized her as weak, vulnerable, and beneath your notice. That kind of snap judgment can be fatal in real military operations." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Morrison felt heat rising in his cheeks as she systematically dismantled his behavior in front of his friends. The second mistake was confusing intimidation with leadership. True leadership inspires others to follow willingly, not through fear or domination. Leaders who rely on bullying tactics typically fail when faced with real challenges because their authority is built on false foundations. Brad Chun shifted uncomfortably, his martial arts background making him more aware than the others of the vast gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Sarah noticed the movement and addressed him directly. "Chun, your training background tells me you understand the difference between sport fighting and combat applications. What you witnessed yesterday wasn't aggression. It was controlled precision. The goal wasn't to hurt Morrison, but to educate him. That distinction is crucial for anyone who wants to understand true military discipline." Brad nodded slowly, beginning to comprehend that yesterday's demonstration had been carefully calibrated to teach rather than punish. Sarah could have seriously injured Morrison with minimal effort, but had chosen restraint instead. The third mistake, Sarah continued, was pack mentality. Each of you made individual choices to participate in behavior you probably knew was wrong because you didn't want to challenge group dynamics. That kind of thinking can get entire units killed in combat situations. Kevin O'Brien finally found his voice. "Chief, we had no idea who you were." "If we'd known." "Exactly my point, O'Brien," Sarah interrupted. "You treated me with disrespect because you thought you could get away with it. That tells me your courtesy is conditional, based on fear of consequences rather than genuine character. Real respect comes from recognizing the inherent dignity of every person you encounter, regardless of their rank, gender, or appearance." Morrison felt like he was shrinking with each word. Every sentence stripped away another layer of the confident self-image he'd spent years constructing. But something else was happening too, a growing understanding that Sarah's criticism wasn't meant to destroy him, but to rebuild him into something better. "However," Sarah said, her tone shifting slightly, "yesterday also demonstrated that you're all capable of learning. The fact that you're here on time this morning, despite knowing this would be uncomfortable, shows character. That's something we can work with." She gestured toward the training facility behind her. "Inside that building, you're going to discover what real military training looks like. You'll learn that physical strength is only one component of effectiveness, that mental toughness is more important than size, and that the deadliest warriors are often the ones who don't need to prove how dangerous they are." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "But understand this, I'm not your friend, I'm not your buddy, and I'm not interested in making this easy for you. My job is to prepare you for situations where failure means death yours and your teammates. If you can't handle honest feedback and challenge in training, you can request transfers right now." None of them moved. Despite their fear, despite their humiliation, they all recognized they were being offered something valuable, a chance to be trained by someone who had proven herself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Outstanding," Sarah said, nodding approvingly. "Let's begin your education." 3 weeks into Sarah Martinez's intensive training program, Jake Morrison found himself 20 feet underwater in the base's combat training pool. His lungs burning like molten lead as panic began to override every rational thought in his head. What had seemed like a straightforward exercise from the pool deck had transformed into his personal nightmare, a test that was systematically dismantling every assumption he'd ever made about his own capabilities. The exercise was deceptively simple in concept. Swim to the bottom of the pool, retrieve a weighted object, and return to the surface while maintaining complete composure. No time limit, no complex maneuvers, just basic underwater movement that any competent swimmer should handle easily. Morrison had approached the task with his usual confidence, diving down with powerful strokes that showcased the athleticism that had carried him through college football. But something had gone wrong at the bottom. As he'd reached for the weighted training brick, his mind had suddenly fixated on the distance to the surface. 20 feet had never seemed so impossibly far. His chest had tightened, his heart rate had spiked, and rational thought had abandoned him entirely. Now he was thrashing helplessly in the clear water, his body betraying him when he needed it most. Above him, distorted by the wavering surface, he could see Sarah's silhouette watching from the pool deck. Her calm presence somehow made his panic worse. Here was someone who had probably spent countless hours in hostile waters, conducting missions that required absolute underwater precision, and she was witnessing his complete breakdown during a basic training exercise. Morrison's vision began to narrow as oxygen deprivation combined with psychological terror. His powerful legs, which had carried him through 4 years of Division I athletics, felt like lead weights, dragging him toward the bottom. His arms flailed uselessly, no longer following any coordinated swimming technique. The confident young man who had swaggered into the mess hall a month ago was drowning in a controlled environment, defeated by his own mind. Just as darkness began creeping into his peripheral vision, strong hands seized him from behind. Sarah had entered the water, with the fluid efficiency of someone for whom aquatic rescue was as natural as walking. Her approach had been so swift and silent that Morrison hadn't even noticed her descent until she was pulling him upward with steady, powerful strokes. They broke the surface together, and Sarah immediately positioned herself to support Morrison's weight while ensuring his airway remained clear. "Breathe, Morrison," she commanded, her voice carrying the calm authority that had become familiar over the past weeks. "You're safe. Deep breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth." Morrison gasped and sputtered, his body shaking as adrenaline and relief flooded his system. The pool deck seemed impossibly solid beneath his feet as Sarah guided him to the shallow end, never once loosening her supportive grip. Other trainees watched from the sidelines, their expressions mixing, concern with the uncomfortable recognition that they could just as easily have been in Morrison's position. "What happened down there?" Sarah asked once Morrison's breathing had stabilized. Her tone held no judgment, no mockery, just professional interest in understanding a training failure so she could address it effectively. Morrison struggled to find words that wouldn't sound pathetic. I don't know. I've been swimming since I was a kid. I was on the varsity team in high school. But when I got to the bottom, I just froze. It was like my brain forgot how to work." Sarah nodded knowingly. Panic attacks are more common than you might think, especially during underwater training. Your body was responding to perceived danger, even though you were in a completely safe environment. The mind doesn't always distinguish between real and imaginary threats. She helped Morrison climb out of the pool, ensuring he was steady on his feet before stepping back. "Tell me what you were thinking about when the panic started." Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment as he recalled the cascade of thoughts that had triggered his breakdown. "I started thinking about how deep I was, how far the surface looked, what would happen if I couldn't make it back up. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed." "Exactly," Sarah said, settling into teaching mode. "You let your imagination create a crisis that didn't exist. Your body had plenty of oxygen, the water was clear and calm, and there were trained instructors monitoring every moment. But your mind manufactured a life-threatening situation and convinced your body to respond accordingly." Around them, the other trainees listened intently. Tommy Kowalski, Rad Chun, Marcus Williams, and Kevin O'Brien had all completed the exercise successfully, but they recognized how easily they could have experienced similar difficulties. Sarah's explanation was helping them understand not just Morrison's failure, but the psychological challenges they might face in more demanding situations. "This is why mental conditioning is just as important as physical preparation," Sarah continued. "During my deployments in Afghanistan, I've seen highly trained soldiers freeze up during firefights, not because they lacked courage, but because their minds became overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. The key is learning to maintain focus on the immediate task rather than getting lost in worst-case scenarios." She gestured toward the pool. "Morrison, you're going to repeat this exercise tomorrow, and the day after that, if necessary. But this time, we're going to work on controlling your mental state before you enter the water. Morrison's stomach clenched at the thought of facing his underwater demons again, but something in Sarah's matter-of-fact delivery suggested she had complete confidence in his eventual success. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd learned to trust her judgment, even when it conflicted with his own fears and doubts. The real lesson here, Sarah said, addressing the entire group, isn't about swimming techniques or breath control. It's about understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to function effectively despite being afraid. Every one of you will face moments when your mind tries to convince you that a manageable challenge is an insurmountable obstacle. She looked directly at Morrison. What matters isn't that you panicked today. What matters is how you respond to that panic tomorrow. Will you let it define your limitations, or will you use it as motivation to become stronger? Morrison met her gaze, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time since entering Sarah's training program, he understood that his instructor wasn't trying to humiliate him or prove his inadequacy. She was systematically identifying his weaknesses and providing him with the tools to overcome them. "I'll be ready tomorrow, Chief," he said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of approval he'd seen from her since their mess hall encounter. "I believe you will be, Morrison. That's why you're here." As the training session concluded and the group dispersed, Morrison realized that nearly drowning in a training pool had taught him more about himself than 4 years of college athletics. Sarah Martinez wasn't just training their bodies. She was rebuilding their understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. 2 months after his humiliating encounter in the mess hall, Jake Morrison found himself leading a team through one of Sarah Martinez's most challenging night exercises, a complex scenario that combined physical endurance, tactical thinking, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated competent sailors from true leaders. The transformation that had taken place within him was so complete that he barely recognized the arrogant young man who had once tried to intimidate his instructor. The exercise was taking place in a simulated urban environment on the far side of the base, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and hidden obstacles designed to test every aspect of their training. Sarah had divided their expanded class of 20 recruits into 4 teams, with Morrison surprisingly finding himself selected as team leader, a responsibility that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Rodriguez, take point," Morrison whispered to the newest member of their group, a quiet young woman from New Mexico who had joined the program mid-cycle. "Chun, you've got our 6. Williams, stay close to Rodriguez, but watch the windows on the 2nd floor. O'Brien, you're with me in the middle." His commands were delivered with quiet confidence. Each team member's assignment, based on their individual strengths and the tactical requirements of their current position. Morrison had learned to read people the way Sarah had taught him, not based on superficial characteristics, but on demonstrated competence and reliability under pressure. Rodriguez nodded and moved forward with the careful precision of someone who understood that leadership meant trusting your team to do their jobs. Behind them, Chun's martial arts background made him naturally suited for rear guard duty, while Williams had developed into an excellent observer with keen situational awareness. O'Brien's steady reliability made him the perfect anchor for the team center. The scenario they were navigating required them to infiltrate a hostile compound, gather intelligence, and extract without being detected by opposing forces, played by advanced students from other training programs. It was the kind of complex, multi-layered challenge that would have overwhelmed Morrison's old approach of charging forward and overwhelming obstacles through sheer force. "Contact front," Rodriguez whispered through their communication system. 2 hostiles, approximately 30 meters, moving toward the main entrance. Morrison's mind immediately began processing options, weighing risks and benefits with the systematic approach. Sarah had drilled into them over months of increasingly sophisticated exercises. The old Morrison would have ordered an immediate assault, confident that superior numbers and aggression would carry the day. The new Morrison understood that successful leadership often meant finding creative solutions that avoided unnecessary confrontation. "Williams, can you get eyes on their patrol pattern?" Morrison asked quietly. "I need to know if there are additional forces we haven't spotted." As his team moved into position, Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The weeks following his underwater training failure had been a systematic dismantling and reconstruction of everything he thought he knew about strength, leadership, and personal courage. Sarah had pushed them relentlessly, but her challenges had been designed to build competence rather than simply test endurance. She had shared carefully chosen stories from her deployments in Afghanistan, each anecdote containing lessons about teamwork, sacrifice, and the difference between leadership and dominance. Morrison had been particularly struck by her account of a mission where her unit had been pinned down by sniper fire for 8 hours, survival depending entirely on their ability to trust each other completely and follow orders without question. During that firefight, Sarah had told them, the difference between life and death wasn't who was biggest or strongest. It was who could think clearly under pressure, who could put the team's needs ahead of their own ego, and who could be relied upon when everything went wrong. Now, leading his own team through a complex tactical scenario, Morrison finally understood what she'd been trying to teach them. Real leadership wasn't about imposing his will on others. It was about creating conditions where everyone could perform at their highest level. "I've got a clear route along the eastern wall," Williams reported. "Hostiles are focused on the main approaches. If we move now, we can bypass them entirely." Morrison smiled in the darkness. The old Williams would have suggested a frontal assault to prove his courage. The young man reporting now understood that victory often belonged to those who chose their battles wisely rather than those who fought every possible engagement. "Outstanding reconnaissance, Williams. Rodriguez, lead us along that route. Everyone maintain noise discipline, and remember we're ghosts tonight." As they moved through the shadows, Morrison found himself thinking about the other changes that had occurred within their group. Tommy Kowalski had discovered a natural talent for logistics and planning that his street fighting background had never revealed. Brad Chun had learned to apply his martial arts discipline to mental challenges as well as physical ones. Kevin O'Brien had overcome his tendency to defer to group pressure and had developed into a reliable independent thinker. Most remarkably, they had evolved from Morrison's collection of followers into a genuine team where each member contributed unique strengths and covered others' weaknesses. The hierarchical structure that had once defined their relationships had been replaced by mutual respect earned through shared challenges and demonstrated competence. "Target building in sight," Rodriguez whispered. "I'm seeing movement on the roof. Looks like a sentry we didn't account for." Morrison felt his pulse quicken, but not with the aggressive excitement that would have driven him months earlier. Instead, he experienced the focused alertness of someone who understood that successful operations required careful analysis and measured responses. "Chun, can you find an alternative approach? We need to complete this mission without triggering any alarms." As his team adapted to the new information, Morrison realized that Sarah's training had accomplished something he'd never expected. She hadn't just made them better sailors. She had taught them to think like warriors who understood that true strength came from precision, teamwork, and the wisdom to know when force was necessary and when other approaches would be more effective. The exercise continued for another hour, presenting them with a series of challenges that tested every aspect of their development. By the time they successfully completed their mission and regrouped with the other teams, Morrison felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal glory and everything to do with watching his teammates succeed. Sarah stood waiting for them in the debriefing area, her expression unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. But Morrison thought he detected a hint of approval in her posture as she watched them approach with the quiet confidence of sailors who had proven themselves capable of handling whatever challenges lay ahead. "Well done," she said simply, and Morrison realized that those 2 words from Sarah Martinez meant more to him than any trophy he'd ever won on a football field. 6 months after the mess hall incident that had changed his life forever, Jake Morrison stood at attention in his dress blue uniform on the sun-baked parade ground of Naval Base San Diego. The graduation ceremony for Advanced Leadership Training was proceeding with military precision, but Morrison's mind kept drifting back to that pivotal moment when he tried to intimidate a quiet woman eating lunch and had instead encountered the most influential teacher of his life. The transformation had been so complete that Morrison sometimes felt like he was inhabiting someone else's body. The arrogant young man who had bullied others to mask his own insecurities had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something he'd never imagined possible. Leader who inspired rather than intimidated, who listened rather than demanded, and who understood that true strength came from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. Around him, his classmates stood with the same rigid posture, but Morrison could see the changes in each of them as well. Tommy Kowalski had discovered a gift for strategic planning that had earned him assignment to a destroyer's combat information center. Brad Chun's combination of martial arts discipline and newfound tactical thinking had landed him a coveted spot in the Navy's special warfare pipeline. Marcus Williams had overcome his tendency toward manipulation and had developed into a communications specialist whose smooth talking now served operational purposes rather than personal advancement. Kevin O'Brien had perhaps undergone the most surprising transformation, evolving from a follower who deferred to group pressure into an independent thinker whose family's 3-generation Navy tradition had finally found its proper expression in principled leadership rather than blind obedience to hierarchy. As the ceremony continued with speeches from base commanders and presentations of awards, Morrison's attention was drawn to Sarah Martinez, who stood with the other instructors along the side of the parade ground. She wore her dress uniform with the same understated competence that marked everything she did, her bronze star and other decorations catching the California sunlight. But Morrison no longer saw her medals as symbols of personal achievement. He understood now that they represented the kind of selfless service that put mission and team above individual glory. The months of training under Sarah's guidance had been the most challenging of Morrison's life, but also the most rewarding. She had pushed them beyond what they thought possible, not through brutality or humiliation, but through systematic challenges that forced them to confront their limitations and transcend them. Every exercise had been designed to teach specific lessons about leadership, teamwork, and the kind of character required for military service at the highest levels. Morrison remembered one particular training evolution that had crystallized everything Sarah had been trying to teach them. They had been tasked with rescuing simulated casualties from a collapsed building while under time pressure and with limited resources. The old Morrison would have charged in alone, confident that his size and strength could overcome any obstacle. Instead, he had found himself coordinating his team's diverse skills, ensuring that Chun's agility got him into tight spaces, that Williams' communication abilities kept everyone coordinated, and that O'Brien's steady reliability anchored their entire operation. When the exercise was complete, and they had successfully rescued all the casualties, Sarah had pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation that he would remember for the rest of his career. "Do you understand what just happened in there?" she had asked, her dark eyes studying his face with the same intensity she'd once reserved for threat assessment in hostile territory. "We completed the mission," Morrison had replied, still thinking in terms of objectives achieved and tasks accomplished. Sarah had shaken her head. No, Morrison. You discovered what it means to be a leader. You stopped trying to prove how strong you were and started focusing on how to make your team stronger. That's the difference between a bully and a warrior. Now, standing on the parade ground with his assignment orders in his pocket, he would be serving aboard the USS Nimitz as a junior officer responsible for training new recruits. Morrison finally understood the full implications of that conversation. Sarah had seen potential in him that he'd never recognized in himself, and she'd systematically developed that potential through months of carefully designed challenges. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, Morrison spotted his family in the crowd of guests. His parents had driven from Texas to witness his graduation, and the pride in their faces was obvious even from a distance. But there was something else in their expressions, a recognition that their son had fundamentally changed from the young man who had left home full of swagger and certainty. His mother had commented on the transformation during their dinner the previous evening. "You're different, Jake," she had said, studying him with the penetrating gaze that only mothers possessed. "You seem quieter, but stronger somehow. More sure of yourself, without being arrogant." Morrison had struggled to explain the change without revealing the humbling details of his first encounter with Sarah. How could he tell them that their son had spent months learning that everything he thought he knew about strength and leadership had been wrong? That his most important education had begun with being thoroughly humiliated by a woman half his size? The ceremony concluded with the traditional passing in review, where graduates marched past the reviewing stand in perfect formation. As Morrison's row approached Sarah's position, he found himself making eye contact with his instructor for what might be the last time. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, gesture of approval that meant more to him than any medal or commendation. After the formal proceedings ended and families began to mingle with graduates, Morrison made his way through the crowd toward Sarah. She was speaking with Master Chief Rodriguez and several other senior instructors, but she noticed his approach and excused herself from the conversation. "Chief Martinez," Morrison began, then paused, struggling to find words adequate to express what her training had meant to him. "I need to thank you for everything you've taught me. Not just the tactical stuff, but everything." Sarah smiled, one of the rare, genuine expressions he'd learned to treasure during their months of training. "You don't need to thank me, Morrison. You did the work. I just provided the framework." "No," Morrison said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced his former bluster. "That day in the mess hall, you could have destroyed me. Could have had me court-martialed, ended my career before it really started. Instead, you gave me the chance to become someone I never thought I could be." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and Morrison saw something in her expression that he'd never noticed before, a teacher's satisfaction at watching a student truly understand the lesson. "The military's future depends on leaders who see potential instead of just problems, Morrison," she said quietly. "Who judge people by their character and capabilities rather than their appearance or background. You've got what it takes to be that kind of leader. Never forget what you learned here." As Morrison walked away to rejoin his family, he carried with him not just assignment orders and graduation certificates, but something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that true strength came not from dominating others, but from helping them discover their own potential. It was a lesson that would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead in his naval career, and it had all begun with a quiet woman eating lunch, who had taught him that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones you least expected.